The wind blew hard against the cliff. A husky puppy held onto a small ledge, shaking in the cold. Sharp rocks waited below, and the top looked far away. Its blue eyes, scared and searching, looked for help, but its cries were lost in the sound of the river. Jack Matthews had only planned to photograph the sunrise that morning. His camera gear hung from his shoulder as he navigated the winding trails of the national park he called home. For years, this had been his sanctuary, a place to escape the ghosts of his past. He didn't expect to hear the faint cries, almost lost in the rustling wind. But as the sound reached him, Jack froze, his instincts sharpening. There was something alive and in trouble. Peering over the cliff's edge, he spotted the tiny pup, no bigger than a loaf of bread, perched precariously on the ledge. Jack's heart tightened. The pup's cries grew louder as it shifted, its paws slipping slightly on the loose gravel. Without a second thought, Jack set his camera bag down and assessed the situation. "This is madness," he muttered to himself, but his body was already moving. Grabbing the frayed rope he always carried for emergencies, Jack anchored it to a nearby tree and began his descent. The cliff face was unforgiving, its surface jagged and unstable. With each step, small rocks crumbled away beneath his boots, tumbling into the abyss below. The puppy whimpered louder as Jack drew closer, its little ears flattened against its head. "Easy, buddy," Jack murmured, his voice calm despite the pounding of his heart. "I'm coming." When he finally reached the ledge, he crouched carefully, his body pressed against the rock for balance. The pup flinched but didn't move, its tiny frame frozen in fear. Jack extended a hand, his voice soft and steady. "I've got you." The moment his fingers brushed the pup's fur, it let out a weak yelp but didn't resist as he gently scooped it into his arms. Holding the trembling creature against his chest, Jack began the arduous climb back up. Every muscle in his body screamed in protest, but he pushed on, fueled by the determination to save the pup. When he finally reached the top, he collapsed onto the grass, his breath coming in sharp gasps. The puppy lay motionless in his lap, too weak to do more than blink up at him. Jack stroked its soft fur, noting how thin and fragile it felt beneath his fingers. "You're safe now," he whispered. Jack carried the puppy back to his cabin, cradling it as if it were made of glass. His home was modest, a small wooden structure tucked away in the forest, filled with the tools of his trade as a wildlife photographer. He placed the pup gently on a folded blanket near the fireplace and lit a fire to chase away the chill. As the warmth filled the room, the puppy stirred, its tiny body curling into a tight ball. Jack fetched a bowl of water and some bread softened with milk, setting it down carefully. At first, the pup only sniffed the food, but hunger soon overcame its hesitation. Watching it eat, Jack felt a flicker of something he hadn't felt in years. Hope. He hadn't intended to keep the pup. His life wasn't suited for companionship. It was quiet, solitary, and filled with long hours in the wilderness. Yet, as he watched the small creature slowly gain strength, he couldn't bring himself to let it go. He named the pup Coda, after a husky he'd photographed in the wild years ago. The name felt right, and soon Coda became a constant presence in Jack's life. Despite the challenges of raising a young dog, Jack found himself smiling more often. The once lonely cabin now echoed with the sound of Coda's playful barks and the soft patter of his paws on the wooden floor. Jack's life had been marked by loss. A widower for 5 years, he had thrown himself into his work after his wife, Emily, passed away from a sudden illness. Photography had always been his passion, but after her death, it became his escape. The national park, with its sprawling landscapes and untamed beauty, had become his refuge. Yet, no matter how far he traveled or how many stunning sunsets he captured, there was always an emptiness that lingered. Even his relationship with his son, Brian, had suffered. The boy had grown distant after Emily's death, leaving Jack with a guilt he didn't know how to fix. Coda, however, was changing that. The pup's boundless energy and mischievous antics drew Jack out of his self-imposed isolation. Whether it was Coda tugging at his shoelaces or falling asleep in his lap, the little husky brought light to a life that had grown unbearably dim. One afternoon, as Jack sat on the porch with Coda curled at his feet, he caught himself smiling at the pup's latest escapade, chewing up one of his old hiking boots. "You're trouble, you know that?" he said, scratching behind Coda's ears. The husky's tail wagged in response, his bright blue eyes sparkling with mischief. For the first time in years, Jack felt like he wasn't alone. And though he didn't know it yet, Coda would one day repay the kindness that saved his life in ways Jack could never imagine. The morning sun filtered through the pine trees, casting golden rays across the forest floor. Jack stepped outside with a mug of coffee in hand, his eyes scanning the horizon for signs of the new life he had taken in. Coda had quickly settled into the cabin, but the bond between man and pup was still fragile. Jack knew trust wouldn't come overnight. From the porch, he spotted the small husky nosing through a pile of leaves near the edge of the yard. Coda's sleek gray and white coat caught the light, and his tail wagged hesitantly. "You're getting brave, little guy," Jack called out. At the sound of his voice, Coda froze, his ears perked up. He looked at Jack for a moment, then darted back toward the porch, pressing himself against Jack's leg. Jack knelt down, his hand moving gently to scratch behind Coda's ears. "It's okay. You're safe now." The first few weeks were a learning curve for both of them. Coda's early days were marked by fear, flinching at sudden movements, retreating to the corner of the cabin when Jack reached for him too quickly. Jack took it slow, giving Coda the space to adjust. Meals became their first ritual. Each morning Jack would set down a bowl of food, stepping back to let the pup approach. At first, Coda ate quickly, his head darting up every few seconds as if expecting the meal to be taken away. "Easy," Jack would murmur, his voice soft but steady. Over time, Coda began to relax, his trust in Jack growing with each passing day. Despite his cautious nature, Coda's playful spirit occasionally emerged. One rainy afternoon, as Jack sat at his desk editing photos, he heard a strange noise. Turning around, he saw Coda wrestling with one of his hiking socks, growling and pouncing like a tiny predator. Jack chuckled, the sound feeling foreign to his own ears. "You've got some fight in you, huh?" Coda froze mid-pounce, his eyes wide. But when Jack reached for a second sock and tossed it gently, the pup wagged his tail and resumed his antics. Moments like these brought life back into Jack's quiet existence, each playful bark and wagging tail chipping away at the walls he had built around himself. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Jack decided it was time for Coda to experience more of the world outside the cabin. Grabbing an old leash he hadn't used in years, he called to the pup. "Come on, Coda, let's see what's out there." At first, Coda hesitated, eyeing the leash suspiciously. Jack crouched down, holding the loop open. "It's just a walk, buddy. Nothing to be scared of." After a moment's pause, Coda stepped forward, letting Jack slip the leash over his neck. They set off along the trail that wound through the woods behind the cabin. The path was quiet, save for the rustling of leaves and the occasional chirp of a bird. Coda stayed close, his nose low to the ground, sniffing every rock and twig as if cataloging the forest. Jack watched him, marveling at how the pup's confidence seemed to grow with each step. When they reached a small clearing, Coda suddenly stopped, his ears twitching. Jack followed the pup's gaze to see a family of deer grazing in the distance. "See that, Coda?" Jack whispered. "That's what freedom looks like." For a moment, the two of them stood in quiet awe. Coda's tail wagged softly, his eyes fixed on the deer. Jack smiled, feeling a sense of peace he hadn't known in years, but trust wasn't built in a day, and Coda's journey wasn't without setbacks. One night, a loud thunderstorm swept through the forest, shaking the cabin's windows. Jack woke to find Coda huddled under the table, his small body trembling. Jack knelt beside him, speaking softly. "It's just a storm. Nothing's going to hurt you." He extended his hand, but Coda didn't move. Instead of forcing the pup out, Jack sat down beside him, his back against the wall. He stayed there for hours, his presence a quiet reassurance. Gradually, Coda's trembling subsided, and by dawn, the pup had crept into Jack's lap, his head resting on Jack's knee. "That's it," Jack murmured, stroking Coda's fur. "We're in this together." As the weeks turned into months, Coda grew stronger and more adventurous. Jack introduced him to the nearby lake, where the pup discovered a love for splashing in the water. They spent evenings on the porch, watching the stars, with Coda curled up at Jack's feet. One afternoon, Jack decided to take Coda along on a short photography trip. They hiked to a scenic overlook, where Jack set up his camera to capture the sweeping view of the valley below. Coda sat beside him, his bright blue eyes scanning the horizon. As Jack adjusted his lens, he felt a nudge against his arm. He looked down to see Coda's paw resting on his leg, as if the pup understood the beauty of the moment. Jack smiled, his heart swelling with a feeling he hadn't experienced in years: gratitude. "You're full of surprises, you know that?" Jack said, scratching behind Coda's ears. The husky leaned into the touch, his tail wagging gently. In Coda, Jack had found more than a companion. The little husky had reignited a part of him that he thought he had lost forever. And though Jack couldn't predict the challenges that lay ahead, he knew one thing for certain: they were no longer facing the world alone. The forest was alive with the quiet hum of nature, the chirping of crickets blending with the rustle of leaves in the evening breeze. Jack and Coda had just returned from a long hike, the husky's paws muddy from exploring trails that twisted through dense trees. Jack felt the familiar ache in his legs, but it was a good kind of tired, the kind that came from a day well spent. After dinner, Jack sat at his desk, sorting through photos from their latest outing. Coda lay sprawled near the fireplace, his tail occasionally thumping against the floor in contentment. The cabin felt peaceful, but that peace wouldn't last long. The first sign of trouble came the next morning. As they walked along one of their favorite trails, Coda froze, his nose twitching as he sniffed the air. Jack followed his gaze and saw something unusual: a metal trap, half hidden beneath a layer of leaves. Its sharp teeth gleamed ominously in the dappled sunlight. Jack's stomach turned. He knelt beside the trap, careful not to touch it. "What the hell is this doing here?" he muttered. The national park was a protected area, free from hunting or trapping. Finding something like this was not only illegal, but deeply unsettling. Coda growled softly, his body tense as he watched Jack inspect the device. "It's okay, boy," Jack said, placing a reassuring hand on the husky's head. "We'll take care of it." He took out his phone and snapped a photo of the trap before marking the location on a map. Back at the cabin, he sent the information to the park rangers, along with a message detailing what he'd found. Within an hour, he received a call from Ranger Sarah Daniels, a seasoned protector of the park and a longtime acquaintance. "This isn't the first report we've had, Jack," Sarah said, her tone grim. "We've found a few traps scattered around the outskirts of the park. Looks like someone's trying to catch animals illegally." Jack's grip tightened on the phone. "Poachers? Possibly. We're investigating, but I need you to be careful. If you come across anything else, let us know immediately. Don't try to handle it on your own." "I won't," Jack promised, though his mind was already racing. The thought of someone harming the wildlife he cared so deeply about filled him with anger. Coda, sensing Jack's tension, nudged his leg and whimpered softly. After hanging up, Jack sat in silence, staring out the window. The forest, usually a place of serenity and beauty, now felt tainted. "Looks like we've got some troublemakers out there, Coda," he said. The husky tilted his head, his bright blue eyes fixed on Jack. The next day, Jack and Coda ventured deeper into the woods, keeping an eye out for anything suspicious. Jack carried a small notebook, jotting down locations where they found disturbed ground or broken branches, signs that someone might have been setting traps. Coda proved invaluable, his keen sense of smell leading Jack to 2 more devices hidden beneath the undergrowth. As the days went on, the situation escalated. Jack noticed signs of more poachers, piles of discarded bait near watering holes, footprints leading off the trails, and even broken fencing meant to keep certain areas secure. Each discovery made his blood boil. One evening, as the sun dipped low in the sky, Jack returned to the cabin feeling more frustrated than ever. He had alerted the rangers to everything he'd found, but the poachers remained elusive. Coda, sensing Jack's mood, stayed close, his tail wagging softly as if to reassure him. That night, a loud crash jolted Jack awake. He grabbed a flashlight and stepped outside, Coda following close behind. The beam of light revealed the source of the noise. A large planter had been knocked over, its contents spilled across the porch. But that wasn't what caught Jack's attention. Scrawled on the side of the cabin, in crude red paint, were the words, "Mind your own business." Jack's chest tightened. He glanced around the yard, his flashlight slicing through the darkness, but whoever had left the message was long gone. Coda growled, his ears pinned back as he scanned the shadows. Jack crouched beside the husky, his hand resting on Coda's back. "It's okay, boy. They're gone." But his voice wavered, and he knew this was far from over. The following morning, Jack called Sarah to report the incident. "They're trying to scare you," she said, her tone steady but concerned. "Don't let them. We'll increase patrols in your area." I'm not scared, Jack replied, though the truth was more complicated. He wasn't afraid for himself, but for Coda and for the wildlife he had spent years photographing and protecting. As the week went on, Jack became more vigilant. He kept Coda close during their walks, his eyes constantly scanning for signs of danger. The bond between them grew even stronger as they faced the threat together. Coda seemed to sense the seriousness of the situation, sticking to Jack's side like a shadow. One afternoon, as they hiked along a remote trail, Coda froze again, his ears perked up and his nose sniffing the air. Jack followed the husky's lead, moving cautiously toward a cluster of trees. What they found made Jack's heart sink. A large snare, its wire glinting in the sunlight, set up near a game trail frequently used by deer. Jack's jaw tightened. He took another photo and sent it to Sarah. As he dismantled the snare, he couldn't shake the feeling that the poachers were getting bolder. But if they thought they could intimidate him into silence, they were wrong. Standing in the clearing, Coda by his side, Jack made a silent vow. "We'll stop them, buddy," he said, "no matter what it takes." The husky barked softly, his tail wagging as if in agreement. Together, they turned back toward the cabin, the fight far from over. The crisp morning air carried an eerie stillness, broken only by the crunch of Jack's boots on the trail and Coda's soft panting. The forest, usually teeming with life, felt unnervingly quiet. Jack couldn't shake the sense that something was wrong. Ever since the vandalism at his cabin, he had been on edge, his thoughts consumed by the poachers and their threats. He kept Coda close as they patrolled one of the deeper trails in the park. Jack had notified Ranger Sarah about his discoveries, but each day seemed to bring more signs of poaching activity. Today was no different. Near a shallow creek, Coda stopped abruptly, his nose sniffing the ground. Jack followed his gaze and spotted another trap, partially hidden beneath a layer of leaves. Jack knelt down to inspect it, his jaw tightening as he noted its size and craftsmanship. This was no amateur setup. "They're getting more aggressive," he muttered, snapping a photo with his phone. Coda growled softly, his blue eyes fixed on the trees ahead. Jack glanced around, his senses heightened. The woods felt heavier than usual, the shadows deeper. Deciding not to linger, he dismantled the trap carefully and stuffed it into his pack. "Let's go, Coda," he said, giving the husky a reassuring pat. "We've done enough for today." They returned to the cabin by late afternoon. Jack spent the next hour cataloging his findings and sending the details to Sarah. His frustration mounted with each message. The poachers were elusive, leaving little evidence beyond their traps, and while the rangers were doing their best, the vastness of the park made it difficult to track them down. As the sun set, casting long shadows over the forest, Jack tried to unwind. He lit a fire and settled into his chair with a book. Coda sprawled at his feet, but the peace didn't last. A loud bang shattered the quiet, followed by the sound of shattering glass. Jack bolted upright, his heart racing. Coda barked furiously, his body tense as he stared toward the broken window. Jack grabbed his flashlight and cautiously stepped outside, Coda close behind. The yard was empty, but the remnants of a brick lay near the porch steps. Jack's beam of light landed on a crude note tied around the brick. He picked it up, his hands trembling with anger. The message was scrawled in uneven letters. "Stay out of it, or you'll regret it." Coda growled low in his throat, his ears pinned back as he scanned the darkness. Jack crouched beside him, his hand resting on the husky's head. "It's okay, boy," he murmured, though he didn't fully believe it. Someone had been here, watching, waiting for the right moment to send their message. Jack called Sarah immediately. "They're escalating," he said, his voice tight. "They just smashed my window and left a note." "Stay inside tonight," Sarah replied. "We'll send a patrol to your area, but, Jack, you need to consider backing off. These people are dangerous." "I can't do that," Jack said firmly. "If we don't stop them, they'll keep going." "I get it," Sarah said after a pause. "But I don't want you getting hurt. Be careful." After hanging up, Jack stood in the middle of the cabin, staring at the broken window. The cold night air seeped in, but he barely noticed. Coda sat at his side, his blue eyes watching Jack closely. "Looks like we've got a fight on our hands, buddy," Jack said softly. The next morning, Jack boarded up the window and set out to reinforce the cabin. He installed additional locks, checked the perimeter, and made sure his tools were within easy reach. Coda followed him everywhere, his presence a steadying force. The following days brought more tension. Jack continued his hikes with Coda, documenting traps and signs of poaching. Each discovery was a reminder of the threat lurking in the woods. One afternoon, while they were walking near a ridge, Coda froze, his ears swiveling. "What is it, boy?" Jack whispered, following Coda's gaze. A flash of movement caught his eye, a figure darting between the trees. Jack's heart raced. He crouched low, his hand gripping Coda's leash. The figure disappeared, but the sense of being watched lingered. Jack didn't pursue. Instead, he turned back toward the cabin, his mind racing. Whoever it was had been close, too close. That night, Jack stayed alert, a flashlight and a heavy walking stick within reach. Coda lay by the door, his body tense and his ears perked. The husky's loyalty and sharp instincts were a comfort, but Jack couldn't ignore the growing danger. As the hours stretched on, Jack reflected on the life he had built here. The cabin, the park, the quiet beauty of the wilderness. It was all worth protecting. And though fear crept at the edges of his mind, he resolved to stand firm. "You and me, Coda," he said, his voice steady despite the tension. The husky wagged his tail softly, his blue eyes meeting Jack's with unwavering trust. Whatever came next, they would face it together. But Jack couldn't shake the feeling that the fight was far from over, and that the poachers weren't done with him yet. The monsoon season arrived with a vengeance, transforming the forest into a chaotic maze of waterlogged trails and swollen rivers. Rain pounded relentlessly, and the cabin's sturdy walls creaked under the weight of the storm. Jack and Coda had grown accustomed to harsh weather, but this storm felt different, more dangerous, more unpredictable. The morning after the storm's arrival, Jack stood on the porch, watching the sheets of rain blur the edges of the forest. "Looks like we're stuck inside for a while," he muttered. Coda, perched beside him, wagged his tail as if to lighten the mood. But Jack's plans for a quiet day indoors were interrupted by a crackling voice on his radio. It was Ranger Sarah. "Jack, we've got reports of flooding near the western edge of the park. A few animals might be trapped. Can you help?" Jack didn't hesitate. "I'm on my way." Grabbing his raincoat and emergency kit, he prepared for the trek. Coda barked eagerly, already at the door. "You're not sitting this one out, huh?" Jack said with a smile, clipping on the leash. "Let's go." The forest was unrecognizable under the deluge. Trails had turned to streams, and the usually calm creek was now a roaring torrent. Jack trudged through the mud, his boots sinking with each step, while Coda navigated the terrain with ease. The husky's thick coat repelled the rain, but even he seemed subdued by the storm's ferocity. After an hour of trekking, they reached the flooded area Sarah had mentioned. Several deer were stranded on a small island, surrounded by rapidly rising water. Jack assessed the situation, his mind racing. The current was too strong to wade through, and the deer were too panicked to swim to safety. "Coda, stay here," Jack said, tying the leash to a sturdy tree. The husky barked in protest, but Jack couldn't risk taking him closer to the dangerous waters. Using a fallen branch for support, Jack edged closer to the water. He tried shouting to scare the deer into moving toward a safer direction, but their fear kept them frozen. The rain made visibility difficult, and Jack's frustration grew. Every second spent here felt like tempting fate. Suddenly, a loud rumble echoed through the forest. Jack froze, his heart sinking. He recognized the sound, a mudslide. Turning toward the noise, he saw it, a massive wave of earth, rocks, and debris barreling down the hill behind them. "Coda!" Jack shouted, his voice barely audible over the roar of the storm. The husky barked frantically, pulling at his leash as the mudslide surged closer. Jack sprinted back toward him, his boots slipping on the slick ground. He had only seconds to act. Reaching Coda, Jack fumbled with the leash, his hands trembling as he freed the husky. "Go, get out of here," he yelled, pushing Coda toward higher ground. But Coda didn't run. Instead, he circled back, barking at Jack as if refusing to leave him behind. The mudslide hit with a deafening crash, sweeping Jack off his feet and dragging him into a swirling torrent of mud and debris. The world became a blur of brown and gray as Jack struggled to breathe, his body battered by the force of the slide. He clawed at the ground, trying to find something, anything, to hold on to. When the mud finally slowed, Jack was pinned beneath it, barely able to move. A small pocket of air allowed him to breathe, but the weight of the mud pressed against his chest, making each breath a struggle. Panic clawed at the edges of his mind, but he forced himself to stay calm. He had survived this long. He had to hold on. Above him, the rain continued to pour, muffling the sounds of the forest. Jack closed his eyes, trying to conserve his energy. He thought of Coda, hoping the husky had made it to safety. But then, through the muffled noise, he heard something, a faint bark, growing louder. "Coda?" Jack whispered, his voice barely audible. Moments later, he felt movement above him. The mud shifted slightly, and a familiar howl pierced the storm. Coda was digging. Jack's heart swelled with a mixture of hope and disbelief. The husky was relentless, his powerful paws clawing at the heavy mud, inching closer to Jack with each passing second. "Coda, I'm here," Jack tried to shout, but his voice was weak. Still, the dog didn't stop. Coda's instincts and determination seemed almost superhuman as he worked tirelessly to free his owner. Minutes felt like hours, but finally, light began to filter through the mud. Jack saw Coda's face, covered in dirt, but filled with determination. "Good boy," Jack murmured, tears streaming down his mud-streaked face. As Coda continued to dig, other voices joined the chaos. Rangers, alerted by Coda's howling, had arrived. Together, they pulled Jack free, their combined efforts finally breaking through the mud's grip. Jack collapsed onto the ground, gasping for air, his body trembling from exhaustion and relief. Coda pressed against him, his wet fur mingling with Jack's mud-covered clothes. Jack wrapped his arms around the husky, his voice shaking. "You saved me, boy. You really saved me." The Rangers helped Jack to his feet, guiding him toward a nearby jeep. Coda followed closely, refusing to leave Jack's side. As they drove away from the disaster site, Jack glanced down at the husky resting against his leg. In that moment, he realized the depth of their bond, one forged through trust, loyalty, and a love that transcended words. Whatever challenges lay ahead, Jack knew one thing for certain. Coda would always be there, his unwavering protector and greatest companion. The cabin was quiet except for the rhythmic patter of rain on the roof. Jack sat on the couch, wrapped in a blanket, his body still aching from the ordeal. Coda lay at his feet, his head resting on Jack's knee, his blue eyes filled with a mix of exhaustion and concern. Jack gently ran his fingers through the husky's fur, the weight of what had happened still heavy on his mind. "You're a hero, you know that?" Jack said softly. Coda's tail wagged slightly, but his energy was low after the harrowing rescue. Jack leaned back, letting the warmth of the fire seep into his bones. The Rangers had urged him to rest and recover, but Jack's mind was restless. He kept replaying the moment he was trapped in the mud, the sheer panic of thinking it might be the end, and then Coda's determined digging. The next morning, Jack woke to a rare break in the storm. The skies were overcast, but the rain had eased to a light drizzle. Coda was already at the door, his tail wagging, as if to say it was time to move. Jack chuckled despite the soreness in his body. "You never stop, do you?" They stepped outside, the fresh scent of rain-drenched earth filling the air. The forest looked different, scarred by the storm's fury. Trees lay uprooted, and large patches of ground were washed away, exposing roots and rocks. Jack knew the recovery for the park, and its wildlife, would take time. As they walked, Jack noticed Coda acting unusually alert. The husky's ears were perked, and his nose hovered just above the ground, sniffing intently. Jack followed him, curious about what had caught the dog's attention. "Coda, what is it?" he asked. Coda barked softly and moved toward a cluster of fallen trees. Jack quickened his pace, his instincts telling him something was wrong. When he reached the spot, he saw a small fawn trapped under a tangle of branches, its tiny body trembling with fear. "Oh no," Jack murmured, kneeling beside the fawn. It wasn't seriously injured, but it couldn't free itself. Jack carefully began moving the branches, mindful of the fawn's delicate legs. Coda stood watch, his piercing eyes scanning the forest as if guarding them from unseen dangers. Once the branches were cleared, the fawn hesitated, its big eyes darting between Jack and Coda. Jack stepped back, giving it space. "Go on, little one. You're free now." The fawn stumbled to its feet, wobbled for a moment, and then darted into the trees. Jack let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. He turned to Coda and scratched behind his ears. "Good find, boy. You've got a nose for trouble, don't you?" As they continued their walk, Jack's thoughts drifted to how much his life had changed since that day on the cliff. Saving Coda had been a spur-of-the-moment decision, one born of instinct and compassion. He hadn't expected it to lead to this, a bond so deep it felt unshakable. When they returned to the cabin, Jack found a note pinned to the front door. His stomach tightened as he unfolded the damp paper. The handwriting was rough, the message simple but chilling. "Last warning, stay out of the park." Jack clenched his fists, his eyes narrowing. Whoever these poachers were, they were growing bolder. He couldn't ignore the threat, but he also couldn't let fear dictate his actions. Coda growled softly, sensing Jack's tension. "Don't worry, boy. We're not backing down," Jack said firmly. Over the next few days, Jack worked closely with Ranger Sarah and her team. They set up hidden cameras and increased patrols in the most vulnerable areas of the park. Jack used his photography skills to document the storm's damage and the poaching evidence, hoping to raise awareness about the threats to the park's ecosystem. Coda was with him every step of the way, his presence a constant source of comfort and strength. Whether they were trekking through flooded trails or sitting quietly by the fire at night, Jack felt an unspoken connection with the husky. Coda wasn't just a dog, he was a partner, a protector, and a reminder of what it meant to care deeply. One evening, as Jack reviewed the photos he had taken, he noticed something unusual. In one of the images from a hidden camera, a figure was partially visible in the shadows. The person was wearing a hooded jacket and appeared to be carrying a large sack. Jack's pulse quickened. He immediately sent the photo to Sarah, marking the location where it was taken. "This could be the break we've been waiting for," Sarah said when she called him later. "We'll focus our patrols in that area. You've done good work, Jack." Jack hung up, feeling a mixture of relief and unease. He knew the fight against the poachers wasn't over, but this was a step in the right direction. He looked amused at Coda, who was curled up beside the couch, his ears twitching in his sleep. "We're making a difference, boy," Jack said quietly, "and it's all thanks to you." As the rain picked up again, Jack leaned back in his chair, a sense of calm settling over him. The storm outside might have been relentless, but inside the cabin, he and Coda had found their own kind of peace. They had faced danger together, and though the challenges ahead were daunting, Jack felt ready to face them, with Coda by his side. The rain returned with a vengeance, hammering against the cabin windows and turning the forest trails into streams of thick mud. Jack sat by the fire, flipping through the photos on his laptop. Each image was a piece of evidence, a testament to the poachers' activities and the damage they had caused to the park. Coda rested by the door, his ears twitching at the sound of the storm. Jack leaned back, rubbing his temples. The last few weeks had been a blur of tension and determination. The poachers had left their mark, not just on the park, but on his own life. The threatening notes, the traps, the constant sense of being watched. It was enough to make anyone feel powerless. But Coda's unwavering presence reminded Jack that he wasn't alone. The next morning brought a surprising stillness. The rain had finally eased, leaving the forest cloaked in mist. Jack decided it was the perfect time to check the hidden cameras they'd set up with Ranger Sarah. Grabbing his pack and a fresh battery for the cameras, he whistled for Coda. "Let's see what we've got," Jack said as Coda bounded to his side, his tail wagging. The trails were slick, but the mist gave the forest an ethereal quality, softening the edges of the world around them. Coda led the way, his nose low to the ground, as they made their way to the first camera. Jack crouched down, replacing the battery and downloading the footage. Coda stood guard, his ears alert for any sound out of Surmos Place. As they moved to the second camera, Coda suddenly stopped, his body stiffening. Jack froze, following the husky's gaze. In the distance, faint voices echoed through the trees. Jack crouched low, his heart racing. He couldn't make out the words, but the tone was sharp, urgent. "Coda, stay close," Jack whispered, moving cautiously toward the source of the noise. They crept through the undergrowth until the voices grew louder. Peering through the trees, Jack saw them. 2 men in dark jackets, standing by a makeshift camp. A pile of snares and bait lay between them, along with several animal pelts. Jack's stomach churned. He quickly pulled out his phone, snapping photos from a safe distance. One of the men gestured angrily toward the forest, and Jack strained to hear their conversation. "This place is crawling with rangers," one of them said. "We need to pack up and move." "Not until we get what we came for," the other replied, his voice low and menacing. Jack's hand tightened around the phone. These were the people behind the traps, the threats, and the damage to the park. He wanted to confront them, but he knew it wasn't safe. Instead, he pressed back into the shadows, motioning for Coda to follow. But just as they turned to leave, a branch snapped under Jack's foot. The sound echoed like a gunshot in the quiet forest. Both men whipped around, their eyes narrowing. "Who's there?" one of them shouted. Jack's heart pounded. He ducked behind a tree, his mind racing. Coda growled softly, his body tense. "Easy, boy," Jack whispered. "We'll get out of this." The men began moving toward them, their footsteps crunching through the undergrowth. Jack clutched Coda's leash, ready to run, but the husky had other ideas. Before Jack could stop him, Coda bolted toward the men, barking ferociously. "Coda, no!" Jack hissed, but it was too late. The sight of the charging husky sent the men stumbling backward. One of them tripped over a log, landing hard on the ground. The other froze, his eyes wide as Coda circled them, growling. Taking advantage of the chaos, Jack darted forward, grabbing the snares and pelts from the ground. "Let's go, Coda!" he shouted. The husky hesitated for a moment, his eyes still locked on the men, but at Jack's call, he turned and raced after him. They sprinted through the forest, the stolen evidence tucked under Jack's arm. The men shouted behind them, but their voices grew fainter as Jack and Coda wove through the trees. When they finally reached the safety of the main trail, Jack collapsed against a fallen log, his chest heaving. Coda stood beside him, his tongue lolling as he panted. "You're crazy, you know that?" Jack said, ruffling the husky's fur. "But you just might have saved us." Back at the cabin, Jack called Ranger Sarah, recounting the encounters and sharing the photos he had taken. "This is huge, Jack," Sarah said. "We've been trying to catch these guys for weeks. With this evidence, we might finally have a case." Jack hung up, feeling a rush of relief and pride. He looked down at Coda, who was curled up by the fire, his tail wagging softly in his sleep. "You're the real hero, boy," Jack said quietly. That night, as the rain returned, Jack lay awake, staring at the ceiling. The events of the day replayed in his mind, the danger, the adrenaline, and Coda's unwavering loyalty. He realized how much the husky had taught him about trust, courage, and resilience. Whatever challenges lay ahead, Jack knew they could face them together. Coda wasn't just a companion, he was a partner, a protector, and a reminder that even in the darkest moments, there was always light to be found. The storm clouds had finally lifted, leaving the forest bathed in golden sunlight. The air was fresh, and the ground glistened with dew as Jack and Coda walked along their favorite trail. For the first time in weeks, the forest felt at peace. The traps had been cleared, and the poachers were no longer a looming threat. Jack had received word from Ranger Sarah that the evidence he and Coda gathered had led to the arrest of the men responsible. Justice, it seemed, had been served. Jack stopped at a clearing overlooking the valley. The view stretched endlessly, with rolling hills painted in shades of green and gold. Coda sat beside him, his blue eyes scanning the horizon. "We did it, buddy," Jack said, scratching behind the husky's ears. "The park's safe again." Coda barked softly, leaning into Jack's hand. The bond between them had only grown stronger through their trials. Jack couldn't help but marvel at how far they had come, from a scared puppy on a cliff to a loyal companion who had saved his life. As they continued walking, Jack's thoughts drifted to his son, Brian. Their conversations had become more frequent since Coda entered Jack's life, and each call felt less strained than the last. Jack had even invited Brian to visit, a gesture he hadn't made in years. That evening, as Jack prepared dinner, the sound of tires crunching on gravel reached his ears. He stepped outside to see a familiar car pulling into the driveway. Brian stepped out, his hesitant smile mirroring Jack's own. "Hey, Dad," he said. Jack walked over, his heart swelling with a mix of nerves and joy. "Hey, Brian, it's good to see you." Before they could say more, Coda bounded out of the cabin, barking excitedly. Brian knelt, his smile widening as the husky sniffed him, curiously. "So, this is the famous Coda," Brian said, scratching the dog's head. "He's even more impressive than you described." Jack chuckled, watching the easy connection between his son and the husky. "He's one of a kind." They spent the evening catching up, the conversation flowing more naturally than Jack had expected. Brian shared stories about his life in the city, while Jack recounted his adventures in the park with Coda. By the time the fire died down, the distance that had once separated them felt smaller. The next day, Jack took Brian and Coda on a hike through the park. As they walked, Brian seemed to relax, his guarded demeanor softening. He asked questions about Jack's work and listened intently to his stories. Coda, ever the center of attention, kept them both entertained with his antics, chasing leaves and leaping over fallen logs. When they reached the overlook, Jack paused, letting Brian take in the view. "This place means a lot to me," Jack said. "It's where I've found peace even when things were tough." Brian nodded, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "I get that. It's beautiful." For a moment, they stood in silence, the weight of unspoken words hanging between them. Finally, Brian turned to Jack. "I've missed this. Us." Jack felt his chest tighten, but his voice was steady. "Me too. I know I haven't always been the best at keeping in touch, but I want to change that." Brian smiled, a genuine warmth in his expression. "So do I." Coda barked, as if to punctuate the moment, and both men laughed. It was a small step, but it felt monumental. That evening, as Brian packed his car to leave, Jack felt a pang of sadness, but also hope. "You'll visit again soon, right?" he asked. Brian nodded. "Count on it." Before driving off, Brian knelt to give Coda one last pat. "Take care of him, boy," he said with a grin. "He's lucky to have you." Jack watched the car disappear down the road, his heart full. He looked down at Coda, who wagged his tail and nudged Jack's leg. "Well, buddy," Jack said, "looks like you've brought us both back together." As the days turned into weeks, Jack continued his work in the park, photographing its recovery and advocating for its protection. Coda was always by his side, a constant reminder of the resilience and loyalty that had carried them through so much. One crisp autumn morning, Jack received a package in the mail. Inside was a framed photo of him and Coda, taken by Ranger Sarah during one of their patrols. Along with it was a note: "Heroes come in all shapes and sizes. Thanks for being one of ours." Jack placed the photo on the mantel, next to one of his wife, Emily. He sat back, watching Coda curl up by the fire, his tail thumping against the floor. The cabin, once a place of solitude, now felt like a home. Life had a way of surprising him, Jack realized. What started as a single act of compassion, saving a puppy from a cliff, had grown into something far greater. Coda hadn't just saved Jack's life, he had changed it, bringing him closer to his son, his community, and himself. And though challenges would always come, Jack knew one thing for certain. With Coda by his side, they could face anything. Together they had forged a bond that would endure, a testament to the power of trust, loyalty, and second chances.